And now we're on Daf Mem Beis, Omid Beis. So the Gemara says that this interpretation of the Brisa cannot fit into the words of the Brisa. For Bein Ketani. It says explicitly in the Brisa that he had a Machshavas Pigul either here, first set, or there, the second set, or third set. Kasha. Therefore, the Gemara rejects Rav Ashi's interpretation, and we go back to Reish Lakish. Now, if we reject Reish Lakish, which the Gemara was fighting very hard against Reish Lakish, then it means that Rabbi Meir's chiddush is that yesh pigul b'chatzi matir. And now the Gemara is going to say that that's impossible. Why? Omar Mar means we're going back to the Brisa, and the Brisa says, Rabbi Meir omer pigul v'chayovna le'karis. Now, if we hold like the Bar Plugta, this, anonymous contender against Reish Lakish, then it would mean that according to Rabbi Meir, even if we don't hold that he had a Machshavas Pigul on the second round or the third round, forget about that. One Machshavas Pigul is enough to generate a Chiyuv Karis of Pigul because, according to their interpretation of Rabbi Meir holds Yesh Pigul B'Chatzi Matir. Michti. Karis Lo Machayvat Shikru Kol Matir. Wait a second. We have a rule. This is a sugi back on Daf. I don't remember whether it was Chav Gimel, Chav Ches. Anyway, back at the beginning of Zevachim, we had a sugya that Pigul could only be effectuated if everything goes perfectly well, and all the other avodas were done without a machshava poselis. So, for example, if he does the shchita with the machshavas chutzes mano, and then he does the zrika with a machshava of shalol lishmo or something like that, then Pigul is not chal as far as the Yisur Karis is concerned. And that's called Achi Yikruvu Kol Matirov, that all the avodos, whether it's shchita all the way till zrika, they're all done with perfect machshavos. And the Omar, this is based on a principle which he tells you, here he tells you on Chav Ches, Kehartzoas kosher, Kehartzoas posel. Ma'artzoas kosher, Achi Yikruvu Kol Matirov, Af hartzos posel ad sheyikru kol matirov. The language here is very interesting. There's something called hartzos posel. It's like from one extreme to the other. There's hartzos kosher, meaning having all the avodas done perfectly well according to the requirements. Of the halacha. And to connect that on the other side, corresponding, we have hartzos posel, which means that in order for one machshava in one avoda to generate a psul of pigul, then you have to have yakrivu kol matirov. That means all of the avodos, other than the one he had with the machshava of chutzes mano, they were all done perfectly well. So pigul cannot take effect unless all the avodos were performed properly. That's the sugya back on Daf Chav Ches. And now, let's come back to Rabbi Meir. Wait a second. If on Yom Kippur, let's say, for example, Bifnim, right, the first set of Hazoyos were in the Kodesh Kadoshim, and at that point he already had a machshava of chutzlas mano, and that would generate a chalos pigul. How is that possible? Because we need ad yakrivu kol matiro. Is therefore psula if already the carbon was possible at the beginning when he had the wrong machshava, an invalid machshava at the time of dazoyos in the Kodesh Kadoshim, is kemandalo adi domi. Then when he takes that dam and he does, adi is an Aramaic word for sprinkling the dam, hadzoyos adam, then basically it's water. It's not dam. He already had a machshava haposeles. So how could it be that Rabbi Meir would say that the carbon becomes pigul when we need ad sheyikavu kol matirov? And now, once he started on the wrong foot, so to speak, with a psul in the carbon, and now the dam is like water, it's meaningless to do any hazoya, then how can you possibly call it pigul, Rabbi Meir, when you need for pigul ad sheyatiru kol matirov? And it's mind-boggling because what is pigul then? A pigul means when let's say the Kohen shechted the carbon almanas to eat the basar carbon chutzes mano, or to be maktir the emurim chutzes mano. I don't get it. Are you telling me that he has to have a possibility that each avoda, once he had a machshava poseles in shchita, then the dam itself is like water. It's no longer dam. So how are you going to have ad she'achshiru kol matirov? How are you going to say now that the holacha and the kabbalah and the holacha and the zrika are all done perfectly well? It can't be perfectly well. There's no dam. I mean, it looks like dam, but it's not dam. So I looked here in the note to see if he relates to this. And he says the following. He says that since the Torah teaches us that if he had a machsheves chutzes mano at the time of the shechita, that generates pigul, we learn that doing that avoda with pigul, with an intention of pigul, is tantamount to performing it properly. Whoa. Properly, it means properly in the sense that it generates pigul. Although the blood is technically invalidated through the machsheves pigul of shchita, the zrika is also regarded as valid for effectuating pigul. So, in other words, we look at the machsheva, we look at the shchita, and we call the shchita valid. Again, the word valid is very strange. Valid meaning to generate pigul. And now we're going to say that all the subsequent avodos are also valid to effectuate pigul. That's the gzeres hakosov of pigul. Now, we also derive the conclusion that a carbon could become pigul if he had it in machshavas chutzes mano during zrika, not only during shchita. However, this would only apply if the Kohen intends pigul during all of the matanos of the dam. So again, even though the dam is invalidated with the first pigul matana, but when the entire zrika is ultimately done with a machshavas pigul, it's considered, again, as we said before, that strange concept of what do we call it? A proper, right? Proper. It's a proper pigul affecting zrika. Now, if the Kohen intended pigul during only the first set of applications, now we're getting back to Yom Kippurim, his zrika in its entirety is neither a genuinely valid one nor a pigul affecting one. Okay, you have to read this over and over and over again. Okay, for our purposes, that'll have to suffice. Okay, now, Omar Rabba. Mishkachasle, when do we apply Rabbi Meir that you can have a machsheves pigul aposeles in one of the various sets, even though, according to this shita in Rabbi Meir concedes that ein machsheves pigul poseles ela bekol amater, but not in miktas, not in part of the mater. Mishkachas la barba parim udalit seirim. Right, there's the par of Yom Kippurim and the sar of Yom Kippurim. And if the dam was nishpach of the first, let's say, par, then we have to bring a subsequent par. and so forth and so on. If the dam of the second par, the replacement par, is nishpach, you're going to have to bring a third par, and so forth and so on. So too with regard to the soyer. And in such a case, after each set of hazoyas adam of either the par or the soyer, if it's spilled on the ground, and you bring a second animal to replace it for each of, let's say, the hazoyos in the Kodesh Kodashim, on the Kaporis, and the hazoyos in the Heichal Keneged the Paroches, and then the Matan Domim of the par and soyer together after you mix the dam. So now we're going to have a separate animal for each one of those, right? Of those four, for lack of a better word, sets of hazoyos. And if he has a machshavas pigul during any one of these sets, it is effective and it generates pigul. Now, why is that so? He needs all four sets of hazoyos. They're all critical. But nevertheless, each set is considered a complete unit. And as we said before, based on the sugya in Yuma, he doesn't have to repeat the old hazoyos. He picks up where he left off. So the blood of one of the animals was used entirely for pigul applications. The blood of the other animals is used entirely for valid applications. Each set of applications is considered a genuine zrika, and pigul can take effect on the basis of the intention during part of the matir, which is the counter shita to Reish Lakish in Rabbi Meir, since the entire zrika was ultimately performed in a proper fashion. Rabbi Meir agrees, therefore, that when all the applications are done with the dam of a single animal, then intention during one set cannot affect pigul because ein pigul b'chatzi matir. Rava Omar, Rava gives another possibility. Afilu teim par echad v'soyer echad. You can even have it in one par, one soyer. And how is that so? Lepigulo meratze. Okay, let's see if we can figure this out. And then we'll get back to the numbers of applications and azoyos on Yom Kippurim. So he says the following here. He says, although the dam is invalidated through the pigul intent during the first set of applications, but lepigul meratze, right? There's a ritzui for pigul, as we said before. It's like valid for ritzui to establish that the korban itself has the status of pigul. So just as when the Kohen intends pigul during the shechita, the subsequent avodos leading up to and culminating with zrika that finalize the pigul designation, even though the dam was already invalid, and nevertheless it generates pigul, so too if he intends a pigul during the first part of the zrika, the remainder of the zrika finalizes and completes the pigul designation, even though it's technically invalid. The invalid segment of a zrika is also considered, quote unquote, valid with regard to pigul. Okay, let's now try to finish up with the calculation of the numbers of hazoyos on Yom Kippur. We said in the Bryce Arboim V'Sholosh that there are 43. V'atanya, the Gemara asks a stira from another Bryce that says Arboim V'Sheva. It means that we're adding another 4 hazoyos, correct? Because 4 plus 43 equals 47. Where do we get the extra 4 according to that brisa? And the Gemara answers, ha kemandi omer ma'arvim lekronos, for ha kemandi omer ein ma'arvim lekronos. Okay. Now the question is, as we said before, after the hazoyos of the par are completed, 16 in number, and after the hazoyos of the soyer are completed, another 16, at that point, the Kohen Gadol will mix the dam of the par that's left in the mizrach together with the dam of the soyer. What does he do now with that mixture of dam? So on that, there's a machlokas. Let's start with the second shita. The second shita holds that ein ma'arvin bikronos. which means that right after the Hazoya on the Kapores inside the Kodesh Kadoshim, on the Paroches in the Heichal outside the Kodesh Kadoshim, they mixed the dam and they applied it to the 4 chronos of the Mizbeach HaPnimi, of the Mizbeach HaZah. But there was never a moment, according to that Man Diyomar, that the dam of either the Sa'ir or the Par separately was applied to the 4 corners as 4 matanos on the 4 corners of the Mizbeach. There was never such a thing. Hence, we only add the number 4, and that gives us the number of 43. However, now we go back to the first Man Diyomar who says Ma'arvin Lekronos. It means that first there were 4 applications of the dam separately, and then there was another application on the 4 corners of the mixture. And therefore, we're going to add 4 to the number 34, and we get 37. Let me just go over this one more time. Okay. I made one little mistake because then we would add 8. No, he's saying that according to the other Tana, they were applied separately, which adds only 4. Then they were mixed together, and then there was Hazoya on the top of the Mizbeach. So that is not included in the calculation. So again, if we have a total of 43 Hazoyos, 16 in the Kodesh Kadoshim, 16 in the Heichel towards the Parochos, 11 on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, so we get 16 plus 16 is 32, and we get up to 43. However, the Brisa that says 47 and counts an extra 4 Hazoyos, they are of the opinion that there was a separate Hazoya before they mixed the dam. I'm not sure why he doesn't spell that out. Just give me one more minute, sorry. All right, he doesn't really spell it out. Okay, let's go on. Now the Gemara has another question. For Tanya Arboim Ushmona, we have another verse that says that there were 48 Hazoyos. So we're jacking it up, even if we hold that there was separate Hazoyos on the dam. Separate matonos of the dam of the Sora and the dam of the Par. Not only that, we have another one. What's the other one? That's called Shvichas Shirayim. Ha kemad yom Shvichas Shirayim ma'akvim, v'ha kemad yomer ein Shirayim ma'akvim. So with regard to the Chatos Pnimis, there's a machlokes tanoim as to whether or not the shirayim that have to be poured onto the soda mizbeach, whether that is likuva, even though in the chatas hachitzon it's not likuva, but it might be likuva in the chatas hapnimis, and therefore we have to add shvichas shirayim, and that jacks it up from 47 to 48. Meisvei. Now we have a kasha on Reish Lakish. We're back to Reish Lakish again. Bamei dvar mamurim. We're going back to the Karban Mincha. And when do we say that if he has a Machshavas Pigel during the time of the Komets and not during the time of the Levana, it creates Machshavas Pigel it creates a Chiyuv Karis on the Achila of the Mincha according to Rabbi Meir, or the opposite where he has Machshavas Pigel during the Levana and not during the Komets, is b'kmitza b'matan kli ubehiluch. Aval ba lo lahaktara is nosan es hakometz machshova v'esalavona b'shtika, o shenosan es hakometz b'shtika v'esalavona machshova. Meir Omer pigul v'chayoven oleha kares. Achomein bo kares ad shifagel kol amati. So what's the case here? We have a case where he did the komets with a perfectly valid, wonderful machshava, and then afterwards he brought the levona with a machshavas pigul. That's against Reish Lakish. Upali Graber still says against the Chachamim that there is pigul. Now wait a second. If he had the pigul second, meaning after the kmitza, at the time of levona, or vice versa, it becomes pigul. How can it become pigul? According to Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish holds that Adam osel das rishona hu osel. And where it says Ema, you have to twist it around a little in the brisa. Kivar nosan es levona machshav. Right? It doesn't mean that he started with a perfectly valid machshav at the time of the kmitza, and then he had a machshavas pigul chutzes mano at the time of levona. But rather, we're going to have to read the brisa as if it said that at the time that he had a machshava at the beginning, at the time of levona, then even though he didn't have a machshavas pigul at the time of the subsequent kmitza, nevertheless kol ha'os al das rishona huos. The Gemara rejects this for two reasons. First of all, chada dahainu reisha. I mean, that's exactly the case of the reisha. Why would the sefer repeat exactly the same case of the reisha? V'yod, and furthermore, Hatanya, it says v'achar kach. Afterwards, he had shtik at the time of the komets. Just 1 second. I'm sorry. Hatanya achar kach, meaning he had a machshavas pigul afterwards at the time of the kmitza, which means that his first machshava at the time of the did I say kmitza? I meant to say levona. So let me say it one more time. He had a machshavas pigul at the time of levona, which means that at the time of the komet, so the kmitza, he had shtika. If he had shtika, how can there be machshavas pigul? How can there be a chalos pigul with an isakaris according to Reish Lakish? If his first machshava was a valid machshava, kasha, and the Gemara doesn't have a conclusion. Okay, this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Mem Beis Amid Beis. I spent a lot of my time doing Mem Aleph, which is yesterday's Daf. So I didn't get past this Mishnah. So if that be the case, I'll plead the fifth, and we'll start with the Mishnah Belina there tomorrow. Okay then? Have a great day.